Let's start here. If you want toxic people to stop bothering you, there's one thing you must do, and you only have to do it once. Set a boundary so clearly, so firmly, that it becomes undeniable. Now, I don't mean some polite, half-whispered preference like, "Hey, I'd prefer if you didn't talk to me like that," delivered with all the resolve of a wet napkin. I'm talking about a line in the sand, bold, unapologetic, and deliver without expectation of approval. Because the truth is, toxic people are not confused. They're opportunistic, these people. Manipulators, narcissists, energy leechers. They aren't wandering around in some fog, innocently stepping on your toes. They know what they're doing. What they're looking for is softness, a crack, a hesitation. They're searching for ambiguity, for that moment when you prioritize politeness over truth. And once they find that gap, they slip through it like smoke. They push, prod, and provoke, not to understand you, but to assess how much they can take from you before you notice. This is where the psychological mechanics get interesting. Human beings, all of us, are conditioned for social harmony. We're wired to maintain relationships, even bad ones, just to avoid tension, and toxic people weaponize that. They manipulate your instinct to stay agreeable, to keep the peace, to be liked. But there's a deeper philosophical contradiction at play here, one that's been echoed throughout Stoic thought and echoed in the work of thinkers like Krishnamurti and Viktor Frankl. Freedom begins where the need for approval ends. The moment you set a boundary, and I mean a real one, you reclaim your autonomy, not just socially, but existentially. You become a sovereign entity. Now, when I say set the boundary publicly, I don't mean broadcast it on Instagram. I mean in the moment with the person who's crossed the line, with words that are unmistakable and tone that leaves no space for negotiation, a look in the eye, a tone that says, "There's no door back in." You don't need to explain it. You don't need a PowerPoint. It's not a committee decision. This isn't about confrontation for the sake of drama. It's about being so rooted in your self-worth that you no longer trade pieces of your peace just to keep someone else comfortable. Because every time you bite your tongue around a toxic person, every time you allow that microaggression to pass without response, you reinforce their perception that you'll tolerate it. And people don't treat you based on who you are. They treat you based on what you accept. Now, the beauty of doing this once and doing it with total clarity is that it changes the energy of the entire relationship. Toxic people don't like walls. They like open windows. When they encounter someone who's not afraid to close the window and lock it, who doesn't shrink from awkwardness or guilt, they disengage. Not because they've had a moral epiphany, but because you're no longer a viable source of supply. But let's be honest, it's uncomfortable. Especially the first time. You'll feel resistance in your chest. The part of you that wants to be seen as nice, as easygoing, will start panicking. That's the old programming. That's the child who learned that love was conditional, that belonging required compromise. But you are not that child anymore. You don't owe anyone access to your space, your time, or your sanity just because they want it. One powerful boundary set with clarity and conviction is worth more than 100 quiet tolerances. When you set it and mean it, you shift the entire dynamic. You teach people how to treat you, not with words, but with action. And perhaps more importantly, you teach yourself what you're no longer willing to carry. So don't wait for the perfect time. Don't rehearse it endlessly in your mind. When the next line is crossed, and you'll know it when it happens, speak with truth, not with fear. Say it once, say it clearly. Then let silence do the rest. Once you've set that boundary, once you've drawn that line and said, no more, what comes next is just as important and in many ways even more difficult. Because it's not enough to speak the boundary, you have to embody it. And that means you follow through, not with anger, not with drama, not with the need to convince them you're serious, but with calm, consistent action. This is where most people falter. They speak the words, maybe even shout them. They say, "You can't treat me like this anymore." But then a few days later, they're replying to the late night text, entertaining the guilt trip, or falling back into the same cycle of appeasement and emotional fatigue. And here's the rub. Toxic people don't believe your words, they believe your patterns. See, people who manipulate others, people who thrive on emotional chaos, they're not interested in what you say. They're watching what you do when no one's clapping. They're studying your reactions like a hawk. Every time you show emotional volatility, rage, frustration, desperation, they learn your buttons. they learn how to play you. So the real power move isn't in arguing louder, it's in removing their power to provoke anything in you at all. Psychologically, this taps into something profound. Toxic individuals are often what psychologists refer to as emotional parasites. Their behavior isn't just disruptive, it's extractive. They're looking to feed off your energy, your confusion, your desire to resolve things. They want the loop to stay open because the loop is where they thrive. So what do? You close the loop. You remove the reward. You become, in a very real sense, unbotherable. Now, that doesn't mean you become cold or disconnected from your emotions. It means you become discerning about who has the privilege of your emotional investment. It means you stop letting toxic people live rent free in your head, dictating your internal weather when they poke, and you don't flinch, not because you're suppressing, but because you've actually moved beyond the need to explain yourself. That's when the dynamic collapses. Philosophically, this echoes ancient teachings from the Stoics. Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." The Stoics weren't talking about apathy, they were talking about sovereignty of self. The ability to remain centered, not because life is peaceful, but because you are. Toxic people lose interest the moment they can no longer shift your emotional state. When they realize their chaos lands on silence instead of reaction, they move on, not because they've grown, but because they're no longer being fed. This is the part that requires discipline. The boundary was the declaration, now comes the embodied response. And that means walking away from conversations that go nowhere, refusing to engage with passive-aggressive guilt, ignoring bait designed to pull you back into the drama. You're not ghosting, you're protecting your peace. You're not punishing them, you're choosing you. And yes, you might feel guilt, especially if you're someone who's used to being the peacekeeper, the fixer, the one who smooths over rough edges to keep everyone comfortable. But ask yourself, at what cost? How many times have you betrayed your own peace just to keep the illusion of harmony? And what would it look like to finally stop doing that? This isn't just about toxic people. It's about you reclaiming authority over your own nervous system. It's about no longer living in reaction to people who don't respect your value. It's about choosing stillness over spectacle, silence over explanation, alignment over approval. You don't need to perform your healing for anyone. You don't need to argue your worth. The moment you stop needing their validation is the moment you become unreachable to their manipulation. And here's the paradox: the quieter your boundary, the louder it speaks. When they sense that the chaos no longer lands, that the emotional games no longer work, they begin to unravel. Not because you've punished them, but because you've refused to play. So here's your challenge. The next time someone tries to pull you back into that old script, don't argue, don't defend, don't flinch. Just be still, be done. Let your silence say what your words never could. Because sometimes the strongest response is no response at all. So you've set the boundary, a line in the sand they can't cross. Then you follow through, no arguments, no emotional theatrics, just firm, quiet action. But here's where it goes even deeper, because this final part isn't just about communication, it's about infrastructure. It's not enough to say, "I'm done." You have to make sure there's nowhere left for them to land. You don't just cut contact, you cut access. You see, a lot of people think they've walked away from toxic relationships because they've blocked a number, muted a story, skipped a holiday gathering. But they haven't really shut the door. They've just left it unlocked, slightly ajar, hoping the other person gets the hint. And toxic people never get the hint, not because they don't understand it, but because they refuse to respect it. Cutting access means something very specific. It means reclaiming every channel, every loop, every little hole they've crawled through in the past. Social media, mutual friends, shared routines, emotional habits, it all has to be addressed. Because as long as there's a hallway into your psyche, they will keep knocking, and worse, you might keep listening. Cutting access is a form of psychological closure. That by holding it's not punitive, it's protective, it's not about being dramatic. It's about being deliberate. Let's talk honestly. Part of the reason we keep these little channels open is because we want them to change. We want the toxic person to look back one day and say, "Wow, I really messed up. You were right. We want justice. We want emotional resolution." And that's normal. That's human. But philosophically, by holding it's a trap, because it means you're still emotionally entangled. You're still orienting your healing around their behavior. which means you're still giving them access. Now, this might sound harsh, but clarity often is closure is something you give yourself. Waiting for someone who wounded you to hand you the bandages is a long, brutal, the kind of self-betrayal. It means every time they reappear with an apology, or worse, nostalgia, they reopen a wound that should have scarred over long ago. You've got to close those wounds not by making them see your worth, but by remembering it yourself. Cutting access also means dealing with your own patterns. By holding you don't just stop them from contacting you. You stop the internal narrative that still defends them. That voice in your head that says, maybe they didn't mean it, or maybe I overreacted, or maybe they've changed. That's not insight. That's your trauma trying to make sense of its pain. And if you leave that voice unchecked, you'll invite the same dynamic back into your life, just wearing a different face. In many ways, this step is spiritual. It requires solitude, discipline, a kind of inner housekeeping. You begin to clear out every inertic thread they left behind, that old message thread you still reread, that gift you never threw away, that playlist that reminds you of the good moments. You think these are harmless, sentimental fragments, but they're not. They're anchors. Emotional relics keeping you tethered to a version of yourself that didn't know better yet. This isn't about bitterness. This isn't about being above them. This is about saying, that chapter is done, and I respect myself too much to keep rereading it. Once you reach this level of self-regard, not ego, not arrogance, but honest, earned respect, you don't need to cut people off with fire. You just go cold. Not out of hate, but out of clarity. They simply no longer exist in the terrain of your life. That's not cruelty. That's sovereignty. And what happens next is subtle but powerful. You begin to notice your mind becoming quieter. Your energy no longer leaks. Your nervous system, once constantly bracing for the next conflict or manipulation, starts to relax. You start hearing your own thoughts again. You remember who you are when you're not bending to accommodate someone else's dysfunction. That's silence, that's stillness, not emptiness. It's freedom. The real goal here isn't revenge or vindication. It's to become so whole, so self-contained, that the very idea of being bothered by toxic people becomes almost amusing. You've outgrown the entire game. You've stopped playing. So if there's still a door cracked open, if there's still a thread left dangling, pull it. Seal it. Finish it. Not because they deserve silence, but because you deserve peace. And if you ever wonder whether it's worth the effort, remember this: toxic people can't return to a place that no longer exists.